Hello and welcome to the Athenry Heritage Centre. My name's Dr. Jeff Dan and today I'm just going to give you a short chat about food in the medieval period and the role that food played in medieval society. Most of Western Europe during the medieval period was governed by a system called feudalism, which strictly striated medieval society into various social classes, starting with the king at the top and then the major nobility, the earls and the lords, followed by the minor nobility, the knights, and then finally at the bottom of the system were the serfs or the peasants. Now food was an important factor in the feudal system as it could be an indicator of your position in the social class. Now perhaps no food indicates or illustrates this better than bread. Now bread was the staple of most people's diet during the medieval period, but the type of bread that you ate would depend on your social class. The peasants, for example, the serfs, would eat roughly ground bread that was made from grains such as barley and rye. And then as you go up the social classes, you would find more wheat bread, more white bread and more finely ground flours. Now, as I say, bread was the staple, particularly of the peasants' diet. They could buy themselves flour and make the dough in their own houses, but they would be unlikely to have ovens to make bread themselves. And so they would often have to pay bakers to bake the bread in the baker's oven. Or alternatively, they could go to the market and they could buy bread directly from the baker. One problem with this, of course, is especially with the cheaper breads, bakers were not unknown to try and make greater profit by adding things to their flour to bulk out the flour so that they could make more money. They might throw in chalk dust or sawdust or handfuls of gravel even. And of course with the more roughly ground breads, there might be little chips and bits of stone that came off the millstones themselves. So many medieval peasants would have broken and chipped teeth because they would bite into their loaf of bread and break their teeth on the stones that were inside it. Now other things that medieval peasants might eat, of course, would be vegetables. They would have a small plot of land that was given to them by their noble lord, which they would pay rent on, but the rest of the food that they grew would be for themselves. So they would eat things like onions, turnips, cabbage, all these sorts of things that they could grow on their small strip of land. If they were lucky, they might have access to milk. And if they had access to milk, they could make butter, they could make cheese, and they could drink it. Now the trouble with cheeses is that they were made from unpasteurised milk. And so particularly with hard cheeses, if they were stored for any length of time, they were liable to be filled with maggots or weevils, which the people would then eat because the maggots would actually taste of cheese. Now, for your peasant, cheese, vegetables and bread would be the staples. If they were lucky and they lived on a water source, they might be able to fish and catch shellfish and things like that if they lived on the coast. But in a walled town like Athenry, the type of fish that you could eat would be strictly limited. If you were lucky enough to find and catch a trout or perhaps even a salmon, these would have to be presented to the noble lord. The peasants would not be allowed to eat them. Now, they might be able to forage as well in the hedgerows and the woods, find mushrooms, berries, that sort of thing. As far as meat goes, peasants probably would only eat meat 2 or 3 times a year on certain feast days. They wouldn't have access to meat in any particular abundance. Now, as you go up the social classes, of course, you find there's a lot greater variety of food. As you get to the nobility, they would eat far more meat. Now, venison was probably the most popular meat amongst the nobility. Even before the Anglo-Normans arrived in the late 12th century, Celtic chieftains would hunt roe deer and things like that through the forests of Ireland. But once the Anglo-Normans got here, they actually cordoned off huge tracts of land, which they called deer parks, where they would hunt deer. And of course, the meat of the deer, venison, would grace the tables of many amongst the nobility. They would also eat wild boar and things like that. Now, as the period develops, you get more variety with the introduction of spices and sugar and things like that. And by the time you get to the Tudor period, Tudor feasts would often feature great centerpieces made out of sugar, which would emphasize the power and wealth of the person throwing the feast. Now, of course, you need something to wash all this food down. Now, for the peasants, that would be beer. They may well drink water, they may well drink milk if they had access to it, although milk was mainly seen as a drink for the young. But the most important drink that most people would drink would be beer. Now, they could brew it themselves or they could buy it from merchants. And the beer that people drank every day would not be as strong as the beer that we have in the bars today. It would be about half that strength, usually brewed with barley or something like that. But they would start drinking beer at a very early age. 4 or 5-year-old children were known to drink 4 or 5 pints of beer a day. Women would drink 9, 10 pints of beer a day, depending on the work that they were doing. And men could drink anywhere between 15 and 20 pints of beer a day. In fact, for many serfs, part of their wage would be paid in beer. There is a record from the 1530s of a quarry in Clontarf, just outside of Dublin, where the men were given a daily allowance of 14 pints of beer a day. And that would be just while they were working. They may actually go to the tavern after that and get a few pints of even stronger beer if they had some spare cash or something like that. Now, of course, for the nobility, you're talking about wine. Wine was an important drink for the nobles. It would not, again, be as strong as we drink it today. They would sometimes water it down so that it wouldn't be as alcoholic as the wine that we would drink today. Wine was an expensive thing. It was imported from southern Mediterranean countries, Italy, France, places like that. But archaeological excavations in and around Athenry have found evidence of vast quantities of vessels that would have carried wine, which shows that towns like Athenry back in the medieval period were very, very wealthy places indeed. Now, of course, what I'm talking about here is the food and the feudal system that would have operated inside walled towns such as Athenry. Outside of the towns would have been a different matter. The Irish, who lived outside of the walled towns, would have had greater access to all sorts of food and drink. Although certain Irish chieftains operated semi-feudal systems, they were much more difficult to enforce outside of the enclosed areas of the walled towns. And so the Irish peasantry would have access to the woods, they would be able to hunt, they would also be able to fish and catch salmon and trout and all this sort of thing. But food as an indicator of class was a very vital factor in upholding the feudal system that ruled over much of the UK and Ireland and the rest of Western Europe during most of the medieval period. For more information, you can go to our website at athenryheritagecentre.com.